Hey y'all, welcome to my channel. This is where I make videos about my transition from working in the tech industry and now becoming a psychotherapist. So if you've watched my other videos, you know that I'm mixed race. Specifically, I'm a mix of Japanese and white. And I wanted to dig deep into what mental health looked like in my two cultures. So today I wanted to talk about two topics, specifically about language and how that affects mental health and our view of it, and like the therapy styles that are most common, and a little bit more about like how the government impacts the therapy styles that are present in these two countries. To begin, let's talk about how language affects the way we conceptualize mental health in these two cultures. So let's start with the word mental illness. In the US, that's the word that we use when we describe people who are having difficulty in their everyday life because of things that's going on with their mental well-being. So mental is derived from the Latin root mentalis, which means mind. And that makes a lot of sense because when we think of mental health in the US, it's usually around like how we're thinking and like what's going wrong in our heads. I hear a lot of my friends who want to go to therapy because they want to change the way that they're thinking. So we associate mental illness and health a lot with like what's going on in our head. And that's really different from how we conceptualize mental illness in Japan. The word for mental illness is kokoro no byoki. Kokoro means heart and byoki means illness. So put together, it's an illness of like your figurative heart. And that makes a lot of sense in Japanese culture because mental illness and health is viewed as something that's a little bit more holistic than how we think of it in the US. Like it's not a problem that we're experiencing in a specific part of you. Mental illness is viewed as when you need improvement in your like overall health. So I think it's really interesting that just the word mental illness and how the way it's been constructed is so different in these two cultures. I read up on how in collectivist cultures, there are less emotion words to describe how you're feeling, and there are more to describe your relationship with others. And a part of that is because your sense of self in more collectivist cultures is dependent on your relationship with others, versus in individualistic cultures, your sense of self is a little bit more of an isolation and it's just you. So there are more words to describe like how you're personally experiencing things, and thus emotion words. And this reminds me of a friend that I had who spoke English and Japanese, and she preferred seeing an English-speaking therapist because it was easier for her to talk about herself, which isn't something that's as common in the Japanese culture, and she had more words to describe how, like, her different emotional states. For her, depending on what language she spoke and what language the therapist spoke, her experience of therapy was really different. Lastly, there are differences in the meaning of happiness. So it's not surprising that like depending on where you live in the world, your definition of happiness is going to be different. What the study looked at was like what kind of emotional state you attached happiness to. And what they saw is that collectivist cultures valued low arousal emotional states such as calmness and relaxation, versus Western, more individualistic societies preferred more high arousal states like excitement and enthusiasm to happiness. And so what this means in the therapy session is that when you're talking about something as broad as happiness and like the state that you want to be when you finish therapy, people may be like associating happiness with different states. That really just depends on you and your background, your experience, and yeah, culture is a part of that. I think it's important to talk about language when we're talking about mental health in different cultures, because the language definitely has an impact on how we view mental health and the ways that we're able to talk about it. Okay, so let's talk about therapy styles in Japan. So one of the biggest differences between therapy in the US and Japan is therapists in Japan view nonverbal communication as helpful to expressing yourself as verbal communication. And that's really different from the US because in the US and Western cultures, we think of therapy as like talking and that being a main component of expressing yourself to somebody else and getting help in that way. In Japan, it's not necessarily viewed that way. Actually, they use sandbox therapy and they use drawing frequently in their therapy sessions because they want to be able to use different modes of expressing self. One of the more famous therapy styles that have been known to countries outside of Japan is called Morita therapy. And to do a really quick recap of what that is, Basically, it's a 4-week program. It was originally created for people who had neuroses or something similar to OCD. So the 4 weeks is kind of broken up into 4 sections. First, you basically just sit with your thoughts and you have no distractions. So there's no reading, there's no hanging out with friends, family, there's no television. You're literally there to be just with your thoughts. And then the second week, you're introduced a little bit more distraction, like you do manual labor. So maybe you're cleaning, you're gardening a little bit. And week 3 and 4, you slowly introduce other things in your life. So you're basically at the end living the life that you typically would. And the goal of Morita therapy is to accept the intrusive thoughts that you may have and learn how to just have them in your head while you live your life. And what's really interesting is I haven't talked about the therapist and the client. And that's because there's little interaction between the therapist and the client. You sometimes do check-ins and talk about a few things, but really it's the client just sitting in silence in their own thoughts. That's most of the work. And that's pretty different from other therapy styles in the US, which is very much dependent on the interaction between the therapist and the client and talking about certain topics. So I briefly just want to talk about how the government affects therapy styles. So in the US, pharmaceutical companies are having a larger impact on the wellness industry, particularly because there are more medications that are being used to treat psychological issues. Obviously, there needs to be scientific evidence when you're creating medication that's for a particular problem or an illness. And because of the push for scientific evidence there, it's also leaking into psychotherapy. So there are more studies that are trying to prove how effective talk therapy is. And that's just where we are in the US right now from what I see. In Japan, it's pretty different because the government is not involved at all. You aren't insured to go to psychotherapy. And so there's a pretty big disconnect between governmental bodies and psychotherapy. And so anthropology, literature, art very much still influences psychotherapy and the styles that are created. So mental health is conceptualized as something that defies scientific evidence and logic. To me, that makes a lot of sense because you can't really create a random controlled trial to show that psychotherapy works for individuals. I think that's why in the US, we don't have a foolproof study that shows that psychotherapy works. And I know that talk therapy doesn't work for everybody, but I think there's a reason why it's really hard to gather data on that topic. Another government-related thing that's influenced therapy is in Japan in 2000, there was a policy that was issued that there had to be therapists in certain schools. And so for a certain period of time, 1 in 4 therapists were working in schools. And so I saw a lot more styles and models that reflected the child-adult relationship and the child-parent relationship more than I've seen in the US. And not that there aren't in the US, but there's just a lot in Japan. Just one thing to note when you're working with Japanese Americans, something that you might notice when the client person sits in front of you is how the idea of hierarchy affects the client and therapy relationship. So in Japan, hierarchy is a very big part of society. You see it in all parts of society. I remember when I was in school and I was on the basketball team and we were playing at a match, I had to fan my senpai because that's what you did. You supported and took care of the people above you, and then in return, the people above you also took care of the people below you. And so that's just kind of how society has functioned in Japan for a while. And you may see that when you have a client. The client may view you, the therapist, as an authority figure, and they may just want advice from you and get your take on the issues that they're having. They may not be as open about talking about the relationship between you and the therapist because they're seen as an authority figure. And so one way to kind of break this down is to help really understand the relationship between the person, the client, and the authority, and just other aspects of their life, and trying to develop a little more individualism. And I'm very careful when I'm saying this because I know that I have grown up for parts of my life in the US, and I don't want to be preaching about how East Asian culture should have more individuation, because it's not what we want. There's a reason why that type of dynamic works in those cultures, but it may be helpful for those Japanese people who live in Western cultures to try to uncover what may be going on there and to help them discover themselves a little bit more. And also it's important to do this really slowly because it's gonna take time and you don't wanna be rushing into stuff like this. So thanks for watching this video. I had a lot of fun doing the research for this because there are definitely things I didn't know. Also, it's just interesting to read up on what's out there and, I don't know, like broaden my understanding of mental health and what it means in different cultures. Bye.